Take your hands off my daughter this instant, or I will ensure you never work in the aviation industry again. The words cut through the roar of the torrential rain slashing against the glass of the private terminal at Ridgeview Regional Airport. Vivian Sterling stood like an ice sculpture, her sharp, tailored blazer immaculate, her eyes flashing with pure fury. At her feet, her 5-year-old daughter, Grace, was sobbing uncontrollably, hyperventilating from the terror of a turbulent emergency landing. Kneeling on the cold concrete was Garrett Vance, a mechanic in grease-stained canvas overalls. He didn't flinch under Vivian's scathing gaze. He didn't back away. He kept his large, weathered hand gently resting on the little girl's trembling shoulder, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Breathe with me, Grace," Garrett said softly, ignoring the Billionaire CEO completely. "Just match my chest. In and out. Slow down, sweetheart. You're safe on the ground now." Vivian's breath hitched. For all her wealth, her global influence, and her reputation as the ruthless commander of Apex Aeronautics, she had been entirely helpless just a moment ago. When the private jet's cabin had filled with panic, Vivian had frozen, unable to calm her own child. Now, this low-wage tarmac worker was doing what she couldn't. "Step away from her," Vivian snapped, though her voice trembled slightly, betraying the vulnerability she desperately tried to hide. "Security, remove this man." Garrett slowly stood up, lifting his hands in a calm, non-threatening gesture. He was 35, broad-shouldered, with the rugged, tired face of a man who carried the heavy weight of the world on his back. For the past 2 years, since a tragic fever had taken his wife, Garrett had been raising his 6-year-old daughter, Bella, completely alone. He worked 60 hours a week, changing oil and tightening bolts on small propeller planes just to keep a roof over their heads and pay off mounting medical debts. "I was just helping, ma'am," Garrett said, his tone entirely devoid of anger. His voice possessed a quiet, masculine groundedness that seemed to vibrate through the tense air of the terminal. She was having a panic-induced asthma flare-up. If she doesn't regulate her breathing, her airway will constrict. "I don't need a lecture from a mechanic on how to care for my daughter," Vivian retorted, her corporate armor locking back into place. Her emerald eyes narrowed as she looked at his oil-splattered boots and the faded name tag pinned to his chest. "You are completely out of your depth. Know your place." The airport manager, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, came rushing over, flanked by 2 security guards. He was sweating profusely, terrified of losing the multi-million-dollar contract with Apex Aeronautics. "Miss Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry," Henderson stammered, bowing slightly. "Vance, what the hell are you doing? Get back to the maintenance hangar immediately. You're done for the day. In fact, hand over your badge." Garrett looked at Henderson, then back at Vivian. He saw the cold, unyielding pride in her eyes, but beneath it, he also caught a glimpse of the lingering terror she had felt for her daughter. He didn't argue. He didn't plead for his job. He simply nodded, reaching up to unclip his security pass. From the corner of the VIP lounge, a tiny voice broke the silence. "Daddy?" Garrett's expression softened instantly. Sitting on a plastic chair by the vending machines was Bella. She was holding a worn-out stuffed rabbit, her wide brown eyes filled with anxiety as she watched her father being yelled at. Because Garrett couldn't afford after-school care, the airfield manager usually let Bella sit quietly in the break room until his shift ended. "It's okay, Bella," Garrett said, offering his daughter a warm, reassuring smile that completely transformed his rugged face. "Just gathering my tools, sweetheart. We're gonna head home early tonight." Vivian looked from Garrett to the little girl. Bella's clothes were clean but visibly faded, her sneakers worn down at the soles. Yet, the absolute trust and lack of fear in the child's eyes as she looked at her father was striking. Vivian felt a strange, uncomfortable pang in her chest. She could buy her own daughter anything in the world, but Grace never looked at her with that total, unquestioning sense of safety. Still, Vivian's pride demanded dominance. She tossed her back on Garrett, kneeling down to scoop Grace into her arms. "Let's go, Grace. The flight crew is waiting to debrief." As Vivian turned to walk toward the executive conference room, Garrett walked over to the flight engineer, who was standing by the terminal doors, holding a digital clipboard of the jet's telemetry data. Garrett tapped the engineer on the shoulder, handing him a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "Tell your captain to check the secondary bleed valve actuator on engine number 2, Garrett murmured quietly. "The autopilot computer is throwing a standard turbulence stabilization error, but it's a false reading. The casing cracked during your descent through the thermal layer." If you take off again without replacing it, the engine will suffer a catastrophic thermal runaway within 20 minutes of departure. The flight engineer frowned, looking at the grease-stained paper. Who the hell are you to diagnose a proprietary Apex 900 turbine? This is classified avionics. Just read the frequency numbers I wrote down, Garrett said calmly. He picked up Bella's small hand, slung his heavy canvas tool bag over his shoulder, and walked out into the pouring rain. Inside the terminal, the flight engineer casually looked down at the crumpled paper. His eyes widened. The numbers scribbled in rough pencil weren't just standard mechanic notes. It was a flawless, highly complex mathematical breakdown of the aircraft's experimental thermodynamic algorithm, a proprietary software code that only a handful of elite aerospace defense scientists in the entire country had access to. The engineer's hands began to shake. He looked toward the glass doors, but Garrett and his little girl had already vanished into the darkness of the parking lot. Inside the exclusive executive lounge of Ridgeview Regional Airport, the air conditioning hummed a sharp, sterile tune. Vivian Sterling paced the length of the polished hardwood floor, her phone pressed tight to her ear. On the leather sofa, little Grace had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small fingers still gripping the edges of a cashmere blanket. "We need the backup flight plan approved immediately," Clara, Vivian said into the phone, her voice clipped and demanding. "I don't care about the storm delays in New York. Route us through Chicago if you have to. I want this aircraft ready to wheels up in 30 minutes. She ended the call without waiting for a reply. Vivian rubbed her temples, feeling a rare, pounding headache tightening around her skull. She hated losing control. Today, between the violent turbulence and her daughter's terrifying medical panic, she had felt completely powerless. It was a feeling she refused to tolerate. The heavy mahogany doors of the lounge swung open abruptly. Captain Harrison Brooks, a veteran pilot with 25 years of flawless aviation service, stepped into the room. Behind him stood David Cho, the lead flight engineer. Both men looked utterly drained, their faces a sickly shade of pale. "Miss Sterling," Captain Brooks said, his voice unusually strained. "We have a serious problem. The flight to New York is grounded indefinitely." Vivian straightened her shoulders, her eyes flashing with ice. "Grounded? I just spoke to air traffic control, Captain. The weather cell is clearing eastward. You have the clearance." "It's not the weather, miss." "Sterling," David Cho interrupted, stepping forward. He held up a crumpled, grease-smeared piece of paper, the very paper Garrett Vance had handed him moments before leaving. "It's the aircraft!" Vivian glanced at the dirty scrap of paper with deep disdain. "Don't tell me you're taking advice from that disgruntled grease monkey I just had removed from the premises. He was a low-level maintenance worker looking for a payout." "With all due respect, ma'am, you need to look at this," Cho said, his hands trembling slightly as he laid the paper flat on the glass conference table. "I ran the manual override diagnostics on engine number 2 just to prove him wrong. I bypassed the main avionics computer and checked the physical telemetry of the secondary bleed valve actuator." Vivian looked down, her cold demeanor shifting into slight irritation. "And?" "It was cracked," Captain Brooks said quietly, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "The casing was fractured right along the stress line of the main housing. The onboard computer didn't flag it because the pressure sensors were still reading normal within the thermal layer. But the structural integrity was completely compromised." Cho pointed a trembling finger at the rough, penciled calculations on the bottom of the page. "If we had taken off and hit 30,000 feet, the pressure differential would have caused a total thermal runaway. The entire right-wing turbine would have detonated mid-flight. There would have been no surviving it." Vivian felt the air completely leave her lungs. She stumbled back a half step, her gaze darting to her sleeping daughter on the couch. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She had been ready to force those pilots back into the sky. She had been ready to risk her life, and more importantly Grace's life, out of pure, stubborn pride. And a man she had just publicly humiliated, a man she had fired and threatened to ruin, had quietly handed them the key to their survival. Who wrote these calculations? Vivian whispered, her corporate authority instantly evaporating into raw shock. "This isn't standard mechanic jargon. These are advanced thermodynamic algorithms." Cho swallowed hard, shaking his head. "That's the terrifying part, Miss Sterling. Look at the variable structure here. This specific thermodynamic scaling model belongs to the baseline architecture of the experimental propulsion systems used by the Department of Defense. It's heavily classified. Only a handful of elite aerospace defense scientists in the entire country even know this formula exists, let alone have it memorized." Vivian gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. Garrett Vance. He wasn't just a regular mechanic. Who the hell was he? Find him, Vivian ordered, her voice shaking with an intense mix of guilt, fear, and burning curiosity. Get Henderson in here right now. I want Vance's employee file. I want his address. I want everything. 10 minutes later, Mr. Henderson was sweating through his uniform as he stood before an incredibly tense Vivienne Sterling. His hands shook as he handed her a thin, surprisingly sparse folder. That's all we have on him, Miss Sterling, Henderson stammered nervously. He's only been with our maintenance crew for 6 months. He keeps to himself, does his job, and never complains. Vivian opened the folder. There were no past employment records from commercial airlines, no standard trade school certifications. Instead, the background check section was filled with blacked-out bars of heavy federal redaction. The only readable text was a brief, honorable discharge notice from an elite, unnamed division of the United States Air Force and a current residential address on Elmhurst Street, located in the poorest industrial district of the city. He saved my daughter's life, Vivian said softly, staring at the redacted pages, and I threw his badge on the floor. While the storm continued to rage outside the airport, 3 miles away, in a small faded bungalow near the rusted train tracks, Garrett Vance was gently drying his daughter's hair with a soft towel. The house was cold and drafty, but inside, a single warm yellow lamp illuminated the small living room. "Are you sad, Daddy?" Bella asked, her small voice cutting through the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. "Because that mean lady screamed at you?" Garrett offered her a soft, deeply comforting smile, his large hands incredibly gentle as he combed through her dark hair. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sad at all. People get scared when things go wrong, and sometimes fear makes them look mean. But we're safe, and that's all that matters." He tucked her into her small bed, kissing her forehead before pulling up a worn-out patchwork quilt. As he walked back into the tiny kitchen, the heavy weight of reality settled into his shoulders. He looked at the empty countertop where his workspace keys used to sit. He had exactly $82 left in his checking account, and the monthly rent was due in less than a week. Garrett sighed, sitting down at the wooden table. He reached beneath his bed and pulled out a heavy, locked steel security box. He inserted a small brass key, unlocking it to reveal a collection of old photographs. A deeply polished silver star medal for extreme valor under fire, and a prototype pilot's wing insignia etched with an experimental military designation. He touched the cold metal of the medal, his mind drifting back to a life he had completely walked away from to protect his little girl. Suddenly, the quiet night air was shattered by the deep, heavy rumble of a high-end luxury engine pulling up outside his house. Garrett's eyes narrowed instantly, his military instincts kicking in. Through the thin window blinds, he saw a sleek, black luxury sedan cut its headlights. But as Garrett watched the front door, he noticed something else, a second vehicle, a dark SUV with completely tinted windows, parked further down the block, its engine idling silently in the shadows. Someone else was already watching his house. Vivian Sterling stepped out of the pristine interior of her luxury sedan, her designer heels sinking instantly into the waterlogged gravel of Elmhurst Street. The biting wind drove the rain against her face, ruining her expensive silk scarf, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was entirely consumed by the image of that fractured engine casing and the terrifyingly advanced mathematical formulas written by a man she had discarded like trash. She walked up the creaking wooden steps of the modest bungalow, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way she hadn't experienced since her very first corporate takeover. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she knocked firmly on the chipped paint of the front door. The door opened almost immediately. Garrett Vance stood there, his large, imposing frame completely filling the entryway. He had changed into a faded gray t-shirt and dark trousers, his blue eyes calm, guarded, and entirely unreadable. He didn't look surprised to see her standing on his porch in the middle of a torrential downpour. "Mr. Vance," Vivian began, clearing her throat to find her commanding executive voice, though it sounded incredibly fragile in the damp night air. "I am here because I owe you a profound apology. My flight engineer verified your diagnosis. If we had taken off tonight, my daughter and I, we wouldn't have survived the climb to altitude." Garrett didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply stood there with a quiet, masculine dignity that made Vivian feel suddenly small despite her billions. "I'm glad you didn't fly, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice a steady, low rumble. "Grace has had enough excitement for one day." Vivian reached into her tailored trench coat, pulling out a sleek leather portfolio. "I don't like being in debt to anyone, Mr. Vance." Inside this folder is a legally binding contract for the position of Chief Avionics Consultant at Apex Aeronautics Headquarters. It includes a salary that reflects your obvious, albeit mysterious, expertise, along with a signing bonus that will comfortably resolve any financial burdens you currently possess. Garrett looked down at the expensive leather portfolio, then back up at her face. There was no greed in his expression, no triumph, just a profound, quiet weariness. "I appreciate the offer, miss." "Sterling," Garrett replied, his tone entirely devoid of animosity. "But I think it's best if I decline. I'm just a tarmac mechanic. I like fixing things with my hands, and, more importantly, I like being home in time to make dinner for my daughter." Vivian frowned, genuinely bewildered by his refusal. People didn't say no to her. "You're declining? Do you even know how much wealth is represented in this contract? It's more than you would make in 15 years at that regional airfield. You were fired today because of my arrogance. You have a child to provide for, a home that requires maintenance. Why turn this down? Because money doesn't buy safety. Miss Sterling," Garrett said, his voice completely unyielding. "And it certainly doesn't buy peace of mind. I gave your engineer that note so a little girl wouldn't lose her mother. I didn't do it to negotiate a corporate salary." Before Vivienne could formulate a response, a soft patter of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind Garrett. Bella peeked out from behind her father's leg, her small fingers clutching the edges of a worn patchwork quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She looked at Vivian's dripping wet hair and soaked clothes with wide, empathetic eyes. "Daddy, the lady is shivering," Bella whispered softly. She stepped out from behind her father, completely ignoring the heavy tension between the adults, and reached up to hand Vivian a small, slightly faded purple towel she had fetched from the bathroom. "Here, ma'am. You'll catch a cold if you stay out in the rain." Vivian stared down at the little girl. The ruthless corporate commander who had terminated entire executive boards without blinking felt a sudden, heavy lump form in her throat. The absolute warmth and innocence radiating from Bella completely bypassed Vivian's emotional armor. Slowly, Vivian knelt down on the worn hardwood floor, entirely unbothered that her expensive trousers were soaking up the dust, and accepted the towel. "Thank you, Bella," Vivian said, her voice cracking with a genuine softness she hadn't used in years. "That is very kind of you." As Vivian wiped the rainwater from her hands, her gaze drifted past Bella into the small living room. On a dark wooden side table, next to a faded digital clock, sat a single, framed photograph. It was a picture of an experimental, sleek, black stealth aircraft, a machine Vivian recognized instantly as the Phantom prototype from a multi-billion-dollar black-budget military project that Apex Aeronautics had desperately tried, and failed, to secure a contract for 5 years ago. Standing in front of the aircraft was a younger Garrett, wearing a highly classified tactical flight suit, his chest adorned with elite commendation medals. Vivian's breath caught sharply in her throat. She looked up at Garrett, her eyes wide with a sudden, overwhelming realization. "You didn't just learn those formulas in a textbook. You're the lead aerospace engineer from the..." Suddenly, the sharp, blinding beam of high-powered headlights flashed through the front window, cutting through the darkness of the living room. Down the street, the dark SUV Vivienne had noticed earlier accelerated violently, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt as it tore toward the bungalow. Garrett's expression instantly transformed. The gentle, patient father vanished, replaced in a split second by a lethal, hyper-focused combat veteran. He didn't say a word. He grabbed Vivian by the shoulder, shoving her flat against the floor while throwing his own body over Bella as a deafening metallic crash shattered the front window, and a heavy, smoke-emitting canister rolled across the carpet. The sharp, hissing sound of the canister filled the small room as a dense, acrid gray smoke erupted, obliterating the warm yellow light of the single lamp. Bella gasped, beginning to cough violently as the chemical fumes scraped her throat. Vivian froze entirely, her eyes wide with a primal terror. In the high-stakes world of international commerce, she knew how to dismantle hostile corporate takeovers with a single phone call. But here, trapped in a blinding cloud of smoke with a shattered window and unknown threats advancing, her brilliant mind locked up. She was completely, utterly helpless. Garrett moved before Vivian could even draw a breath to scream. With absolute practiced precision, he snatched the purple towel from Vivian's hands, pressed it firmly over Bella's nose and mouth, and scooped his daughter up into his left arm. His right hand clamped onto Vivian's wrist with a grip like forged steel. "Breathe shallow," Garrett commanded, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that cut straight through the chaos. Stay low. Follow my boots. He dragged Vivian through the blinding smoke toward the back of the house. Vivian stumbled, her designer heels slipping on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, but Garrett's grip never wavered. He was an unyielding pillar of strength, completely unfazed by the sudden violence invading his home. Garrett threw open the heavy wooden back door, stepping out into the cold, driving rain of the rear alleyway. The freezing water instantly washed away the stinging smoke, but the danger was far from over. From the shadows of the neighboring fence, two large figures dressed in dark, unmarked tactical gear emerged, their faces obscured by ballistic masks. One of them raised a heavy, high-voltage stun weapon, aiming it directly at Garrett's chest. Garrett didn't flinch. He smoothly stepped in front of Vivian, shielding both her and Bella with his massive frame. In a fraction of a second, he placed Bella gently behind a heavy iron workbench on the back porch. Before the first attacker could pull his trigger, Garrett lunged forward into the rain. His movements weren't those of a standard street fighter. They were fluid, lethal, and perfectly optimized. Garrett deflected the attacker's extended arm with a brutal upward block, shattering the man's wrist instantly. In the same motion, his elbow drove hard into the second attacker's jaw. The sound of fracturing bone cracked through the sound of the downpour. Both men collapsed into the wet gravel, completely neutralized in less than 3 seconds. Vivian watched from the porch, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. Her body trembled uncontrollably from the sheer speed of the violence. This man was supposed to be a low-wage mechanic. Who on earth was he? Suddenly, the sharp, aggressive ringtone of Vivian's encrypted corporate phone blared from her trench coat. Her shaking fingers fumbled with the device before she finally managed to press it to her ear. "Miss Sterling!" Captain Brooks's voice exploded through the speaker, laced with absolute panic and heavy breathing. "We've been hit." A rogue security team bypassed the local airfield guards. They had corporate clearance codes from the executive board. Oh God, Miss Sterling. They took Grace. They forced her into a non-registered transport helicopter on Hangar Pad 4. The phone slipped from Vivian's hand, crashing into the mud at her feet. The powerful, intimidating CEO of Apex Aeronautics completely disintegrated. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the wet wooden steps of the porch, her face buried in her hands as deep, hysterical sobs tore through her chest. The ruthless negotiator who ruled over thousands of employees was gone. In her place was a terrified, heartbroken mother who couldn't protect her baby. "They have Grace!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking with pure agony as she looked up at Garrett, her eyes wild with despair. "They took my daughter!" Montgomery Cross, the rival chairman of Vanguard Aerospace. "He warned me he would take everything if I didn't sign the merger. My money can't save her. I have all the wealth in the world, and I can't protect my own child." Bella crept out from behind the workbench, her own eyes filled with tears as she saw the powerful woman weeping so helplessly. Bella wrapped her small, warm arms around Vivian's neck, offering the only comfort she knew how to give. "Don't cry, ma'am. My daddy is here. My daddy fixes everything." Garrett stepped into the light of the porch, the rain cascading down his rugged face. He didn't look angry, he looked entirely focused, a quiet, protective masculinity radiating from his posture. He knelt down in the mud in front of Vivian, placing his large, warm hands firmly on her shaking shoulders. "Vivian, look at me," Garrett said, using her first name with a commanding authority that forced her eyes to meet his calm blue gaze. "Listen to my voice. The airport is 4 miles away. In a severe weather cell like this, a non-military transport helicopter cannot clear the eastern mountain ridge without manual stability adjustments. They are stuck on the tarmac, waiting for a wind window. We have exactly 7 minutes." Vivian wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "But how? My car's tires are slashed, and the airfield security belongs to the board. We can't get past them." Garrett stood up, walking toward the old, rusted barn at the edge of his property. He grabbed the heavy iron padlock, breaking it open with a single, massive pull of a crowbar. He threw open the double wooden doors, revealing what lay hidden beneath a massive canvas tarp. Garrett yanked the tarp away. Sitting in the dim light was a vehicle that defied civilian logic, a heavy-duty, matte black tactical assault truck, armored to military specifications, boasting an experimental turbine engine and a massive, glowing dual-screen satellite communications array mounted directly onto the dashboard. It was a multi-million-dollar government prototype, a machine that technically didn't exist on any public registry. Garrett climbed into the driver's seat, flipping a row of heavy metallic switches. The massive turbine engine roared to life with a deep, terrifying hum that vibrated through the very ground beneath their feet. The dual monitors flashed to life, immediately intercepting and decoding the encrypted aviation frequencies of Ridgeview Regional Airport. A bright, pulsing red tracking dot appeared directly over Hangar Pad 4. "They haven't left the ground yet," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a chilling, lethal calm as he looked down at Vivian from the cabin. "Get in the truck. We're going to get your daughter back." Vivian climbed into the high cabin of the tactical vehicle, her mind spinning as she buckled herself into the heavy, military-grade bucket seat. In the back, Garrett was already securing Bella into a specialized, impact-resistant safety harness. He checked the straps twice, his touch unbelievably tender despite the terrifying urgency of the situation. "You stay low and hold on to your rabbit, Bella," Garrett said, his voice entirely soft as he brushed a stray lock of hair from his daughter's face. "Daddy has to drive fast, okay?" "I know, Daddy," Bella replied, her small voice steady. "Bring Grace back." Garrett climbed back into the driver's seat, his large hands gripping the thick leather steering wheel. He slammed the vehicle into gear, and the massive truck tore out of the rusted barn, its heavy-duty tires throwing mud and gravel high into the rainy night air. Vivian stared at the glowing digital monitors on the dashboard. The screen was mapping out the entire grid of Ridgeview Regional Airport, flashing data streams that she had never seen in any civilian aviation system. She looked at Garrett, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. "What is this truck?" Vivian asked, her voice trembling as the vehicle surged down Elmhurst Street, ignoring the deep floodwaters that would have swallowed her luxury sedan. "Who are you, Garrett?" "Those calculations back at the terminal, this vehicle. You aren't just an Air Force veteran." Garrett didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the dark, rain-slicked road ahead, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding concentration. 5 years ago, I was the chief test pilot and structural engineer for the Black Sky Initiative," Garrett said, his tone low and flat. "I designed the propulsion algorithms that your company and Vanguard Aerospace have been trying to steal for half a decade. When my wife became sick, the military wouldn't let me retire. They told me my mind was government property. So, I took my daughter, changed my identity, and buried myself in a small-town hangar. I chose a simple life because a simple life was the only way to keep my daughter safe from men like Montgomery Cross." Vivian felt a cold chill run down her spine. The very algorithms her company had spent hundreds of millions trying to develop were created by the man she had just called a low-wage grease monkey. She had looked down on him from her mountain of wealth, completely blind to the fact that he possessed a mind worth more than her entire corporate empire. The truck roared as Garrett slammed his foot onto the accelerator, entering the main highway leading toward the regional airfield. The digital tracker on the dashboard began to beep aggressively, the red dot indicating that the rogue helicopter on Hangar Pad 4 was spinning its rotors, preparing for an illegal, high-risk departure through the storm. "They are clearing the engine blocks," Garrett muttered, his fingers flicking a switch that activated the truck's localized frequency jammer. "I'm shutting down their external satellite relays. They won't be able to communicate with Cross's offshore extraction team, but it also means they're going to try to lift off visually. They're desperate." Up ahead, the gleaming, lit-up perimeter of Ridgeview Regional Airport appeared through the blinding sheet of rain. The main security gate was heavily fortified, blocked by a massive, reinforced steel barrier, and guarded by 3 private security SUVs belonging to the corrupt airfield guards who had been bought off by Vanguard Aerospace. "Garrett," Vivian gasped, her hands gripping the dashboard as she saw the armed guards stepping into the road, raising high-powered rifles toward the oncoming truck. "Stop! They have barricades!" "They'll open fire. Hold on," Garrett said simply. He didn't tap the brakes. Instead, he hit a heavy crimson toggle labeled overdrive. The prototype turbine engine gave a deafening metallic shriek, and the armored truck accelerated violently, transforming into a 7-ton battering ram. The guards outside panicked, seeing the massive, matte black beast of a vehicle charging at them like an unstoppable freight train. They threw their weapons down and dove into the wet grass of the ditches. The truck slammed into the reinforced steel security gate at 70 miles per hour. The sound of fracturing metal erupted like a bomb detonating. The heavy steel barrier shattered into twisted pieces, flying into the air as the tactical truck plowed straight onto the tarmac, its high-powered headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the wide, open runways. In the distance, on hangar pad 4, a twin-engine transport helicopter was violently swaying in the heavy winds, its massive rotor blades tearing through the downpour, generating a blinding mist of water. Through the rain-streaked windshield of the truck, Vivian could see the silhouette of a man in dark gear forcing a crying little girl up the passenger steps of the aircraft. Grace. Vivian screamed, her maternal instinct taking over as she violently banged her hands against the passenger window. "That's her! They're putting her inside!" Garrett twisted the steering wheel, throwing the heavy truck into a massive, controlled drift across the flooded runway. The tires shrieked against the wet asphalt, sending a 10-foot wall of spray into the air as the vehicle roared directly toward the spinning tail rotor of the helicopter, aiming to block its path of escape. But inside the helicopter cockpit, the rogue pilot saw the oncoming truck. Desperate and realizing they were being cornered, he pulled back violently on the collective control stick. The massive helicopter surged upward, its landing skids lifting off the concrete tarmac, rising 5, 10, 15 feet into the stormy air, just as Garrett's truck slammed to a halt directly beneath it. The sudden updraft from the rotor blades battered the tactical truck, threatening to capsize it. Vivian looked up through the glass sunroof, her face pale with pure horror, as she saw her daughter's tiny hands pressing against the window of the ascending helicopter, screaming for her mother. "No!" Vivian shrieked, turning to Garrett in absolute weeping despair. "They're leaving! They're taking her! Please! Garrett, do something!" Garrett Vance looked up at the rising aircraft, his blue eyes flashing with a dangerous, icy resolve. He unbuckled his harness, reached beneath his seat, and pulled out a heavy, specialized pneumatic launching rifle, equipped with a high-tensile steel cable. "Stay in the truck," Garrett ordered, his voice echoing with a terrifyingly steady authority. He threw open the driver's side door, stepping directly into the roaring, freezing hurricane of the helicopter's rotor wash, completely alone against the storm. The howling wind of the helicopter's rotor wash battered Garrett's face, driving the freezing rain against his skin like needles. He stood perfectly balanced on the slick tarmac, his large hands steady as he hoisted the heavy pneumatic launching rifle to his shoulder. He didn't look at the sky. He looked at the physics of the target. With a deafening hiss of compressed air, Garrett pulled the trigger. The high-tensile steel cable erupted from the barrel, slicing through the wall of rain. The magnetized grappling hook caught the rear support brace of the helicopter's landing skid with a heavy metallic clang, locking into place with a death grip. Garrett didn't lose a second. He vaulted back toward the front bumper of his armored truck, slamming the trailing loop of the steel cable into the high-capacity military winch assembly. He reached into the open driver's door and hit the rapid retract sequence. The truck's prototype turbine engine let out a savage roar, its automated gears a yee-et time into place. The steel cable snapped taut instantly, humming with immense tension. The 7-ton armored truck groaned against the sudden pull, its heavy-duty tires anchoring deep into the asphalt. Up above, the transport helicopter jerked violently. The pilot pulled back desperately on the controls, trying to fight the immense downward force, but civilian aviation machinery was no match for a military-grade winch. The helicopter's tail rotor began to fishtail wildly in the storm, the engine screaming as it stalled under the impossible load. Realizing they were about to flip over and detonate mid-air, the rogue pilot was forced to dump the collective pitch, bringing the aircraft slamming back down onto the concrete tarmac of hangar pad 4. The moment the skids touched the ground, Garrett was moving. He sprinted across the flooded concrete, a shadow passing through the blinding spray. He violently wrenched open the helicopter's side cabin door. Inside, the remaining Vanguard security guard raised his weapon, but Garrett was already inside his guard. With a lightning-fast sequence of a sweeping open-hand strike and a brutal knee execution, Garrett disarmed the man and sent him crashing unconscious into the cockpit partition. Grace was huddled in the back corner, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. Garrett immediately dropped his defensive posture, his large frame softening instantly as he reached out with his large, warm hands. "Hey, sweetheart," Garrett said, his low voice entirely gentle as he unbuckled her. "Your mom is right outside. You're completely safe now." Grace threw her small arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder. Garrett carried her out of the cabin, shielding her from the rain with his broad shoulders as he walked down the steps. Vivian was already running across the tarmac, her expensive coat abandoned, her designer heels long gone as she sprinted barefoot through the puddles. Garrett gently handed the little girl into her arms. Vivian collapsed to her knees on the wet concrete, holding Grace so tightly it seemed she would never let go. She buried her face in her daughter's wet hair, weeping with an intensity that completely shattered her cold, unyielding corporate persona. "Thank you," Vivian choked out through her tears, looking up at Garrett with eyes full of overwhelming gratitude and deep reverence. "Thank you." Suddenly, the dark airfield was completely flooded with brilliant, blinding light. The deafening wail of multiple sirens echoed across the runways as a massive convoy of black federal utility vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and military transports swarmed Hangar Pad 4, completely surrounding the area in a perfect tactical perimeter. Dozens of elite, heavily armed soldiers in desert camo uniforms jumped out of the vehicles, weapons raised, creating a wall of absolute authority. From the edge of the perimeter, Mr. Henderson, the nervous airfield manager, came running forward alongside 3 airport police officers, pointing a trembling finger directly at Garrett. "Arrest him!" Henderson shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "He destroyed the main security gates. He's driving an unregistered military vehicle. He's a rogue mechanic threatening our clients." The soldiers ignored Henderson completely, parting to create a clear lane as a high-ranking military official stepped into the light. General Arthur Pendleton, a decorated 4-star general wearing a heavy tactical trench coat over his formal uniform, walked forward. His stern, weathered face was set in stone as his sharp eyes scanned the scene, landing squarely on Garrett Vance. Henderson smirked, stepping closer to the general. "General Pendleton, sir. Thank goodness you're here. This low-wage tarmac worker has completely compromised airport safety." "Shut your mouth, Henderson," General Pendleton snapped, his voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of a military commander. Henderson froze, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. General Pendleton walked past the trembling airport manager, directly up to the oil-stained, grease-splattered single father. The general stopped exactly 2 paces away, stood at absolute attention, and snapped a crisp, profoundly respectful military salute directly to Garrett Vance. The entire tarmac fell into a dead, stunned silence. The airport police lowered their weapons. "Mr. Henderson looked as though he were about to faint. Vivian Sterling, still holding her daughter on the wet concrete, stared up at the scene, her brilliant mind spinning as the pieces of the puzzle finally slammed together. "Colonel Vance," General Pendleton said, his voice echoing clearly across the public airfield, filled with deep administrative respect. "The Pentagon has been searching for you for 5 long years. The Secretary of Defense orders you back to headquarters. We need the creator of the Black Sky Initiative. Your retirement is officially suspended." Garrett slowly stood tall, his posture perfectly matching the general's. The quiet, humble mechanic had completely vanished. In his place stood a legendary military titan, a man whose intellect and bravery had shaped the very future of American aerospace defense. "I'm a father now, General," Garrett replied, his voice calm, steady, and entirely unafraid of the military might standing before him. "My daughter is my only initiative." General Pendleton glanced over at the armored truck, where Bella was watching quietly through the window, holding her stuffed rabbit. The general sighed, lowering his hand. "We know about Montgomery Cross and the Vanguard Aerospace plot, Colonel. We intercepted their offshore relays. Vanguard is being dismantled by federal authorities as we speak, but the nation still needs your mind, Garrett. You can't hide under car hoods forever." Vivienne slowly stood up, cradling Grace against her chest. She looked at Garrett, the man she had insulted, the man she had fired, the man who had effortlessly saved her life and her daughter's life without asking for a single dollar in return. The ultimate realization hit her with a profound emotional force. She had all the billions in the world, but this humble single father possessed a quiet, unyielding power that money could never buy. General Pendleton stared at Garrett for a long, heavy moment. The rain hammered against the fabric of the general's heavy trench coat, but the seasoned commander didn't break eye contact with the man who had once been the military's greatest hidden asset. He looked from Garrett's unyielding expression to the small girl watching anxiously from the window of the armored truck. "A man who fights for his country is formidable, Colonel," General Pendleton said softly, his voice dropping below the roar of the wind. "But a man who fights for his child is completely unstoppable. I won't force you into a cage, Garrett. But the world is getting smaller, and the technology you created is a prize everyone wants. You need a shield." "He doesn't need a shield from the Pentagon, General," Vivian Sterling interrupted, her voice steady and resonant as she stepped forward. The icy, arrogant billionaire who had arrived at the airfield hours ago had completely vanished. Though her clothes were wet and her hair was tangled from the storm, Vivian stood with a new kind of power, one forged in deep humility and an absolute fierce clarity. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Garrett, looking directly at the four-star general. Apex Aeronautics is pulling out of all manufacturing bids with Vanguard Aerospace effective immediately, Vivian declared, her eyes flashing with absolute authority. Tomorrow morning, I am restructuring my company's entire defense portfolio. I am placing a multi-billion-dollar legal and corporate firewall around Colonel Vance and his daughter. If anyone, civilian or government, attempts to compromise his privacy or his freedom, they will have to dismantle my entire global empire first. General Pendleton looked at Vivian, a faint, respectful smile touching the corners of his weathered mouth. It seems you've found a very powerful ally, Garrett. Very well. The military will monitor the fallout of Montgomery Cross's arrest. For now, Colonel, you are officially off the radar. The general offered one last, deeply respectful salute, turned on his heel, and began shouting orders to his men. Within minutes, the massive military convoy began to roll out, the blinding searchlights fading into the damp darkness of the midnight sky. Mr. Henderson stood frozen by the edge of the hangar, his face completely devoid of color. He looked at Vivian, his hands shaking as he tried to find his voice. Miss Sterling, I was only trying to protect the airport's liability. I didn't know. You are terminated, Henderson. Vivian cut him off, her voice dropping into a chilling, absolute calm, effective this exact second. Pack your things, leave the property, and pray my legal team doesn't find your name on the offshore transaction logs from Vanguard Aerospace. Get out of my sight. The former airfield manager stumbled backward, turning and running into the shadows of the rain-slicked terminal. An hour later, the storm finally began to break, leaving behind a quiet, mist-covered airfield. Inside the warm, ultra-luxurious private holding suite of Apex Aeronautics, the atmosphere was entirely peaceful. A crackling fire hummed in the stone hearth, casting a warm golden glow across the room. On the large plush sofa, Grace and Bella were sitting side by side. The initial fear had completely melted away. Bella had wrapped her worn patchwork quilt around both of their shoulders, and she was gently handing her favorite stuffed rabbit to Grace. He likes it when you hold his ears, Bella whispered softly, her face bright with a comforting smile. He makes the bad dreams go away. Grace accepted the toy, hugging it tightly against her chest as a soft, genuine smile finally broke across her face. Thank you, Bella. Vivian stood by the large glass window, watching the two little girls. She held a warm cup of tea, but her hands were still trembling slightly. The emotional exhaustion of almost losing her child was crashing down on her, stripping away the ruthless executive persona she had spent her entire adult life constructing. She realized that in her pursuit of wealth, power, and absolute control, she had built a massive, lonely fortress. She had everything the world could offer, yet until tonight, she had never known true peace. Garrett stepped up beside her, holding a clean towel. He didn't say anything at first. His large, grounded presence immediately filled the space around her, bringing a profound sense of safety that Vivian had never felt from any security detail or corporate board. You should dry your hair, Vivian, Garrett said softly, his voice a low, comforting anchor in the quiet room. Vivian turned to look at him. Her green eyes met his calm blue gaze, and for the first time in her life, she let her guard drop entirely. A single, silent tear slipped down her cheek. I was so cruel to you, Garrett, she whispered, her voice cracking with a raw, painful vulnerability. When I look back at how I treated you in that terminal, how I looked down on you because of your clothes, because of your job, I feel physically sick. You saved my daughter's life twice tonight, and you didn't hesitate for a single second, even after I tried to ruin you. Garrett looked down at her, his rugged face entirely gentle. He reached out, his large, warm hand lightly resting on her shoulder. The touch was completely respectful, yet a sudden, intense emotional current seemed to pass between them, vibrating in the silence of the room. Fear makes people do strange things, Vivian, Garrett said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute sincerity. You don't have to apologize. You were a mother terrified for her child. I know what that feels like. When you've lost the person you love most, you build walls to make sure nothing can ever hurt what's left. I didn't see an arrogant CEO tonight. I just saw a mother who needed help. Vivian looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest for a completely different reason now. Her breath hitched as she gazed into the eyes of a man who possessed absolutely nothing in terms of material vanity, yet gave away total security and warmth without even trying. How do you do it? Vivian asked softly, stepping slightly closer to him, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his sleeve. How do you stay so steady when everything around you is falling apart? Because I know exactly what matters, Garrett replied, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register. He didn't pull away. His gaze lingered on her lips for a fraction of a second before moving back to her eyes, the tension between them growing thick and heavy. It's not the companies we build, and it's definitely not the numbers in a bank account. It's the people we choose to protect. Before Vivian could reply, the quiet air was broken by the sharp vibration of Garrett's old tactical radio sitting on the table. A high-frequency alert code began to flash across the small digital screen, accompanied by an automated voice message from the Federal Encrypted Network. Warning: Vanguard Aerospace assets liquidated. Final transport manifest intercepted. Project Black Sky data breach detected at off-site private vault. Garrett's expression hardened instantly as he looked at the flashing screen. The final piece of Montgomery Cross's conspiracy wasn't just a corporate merger. Someone inside Vivian's own executive inner circle had betrayed her, and the stolen military data was already moving toward a secondary buyer. Garrett's fingers flew across the secondary monitor of the tactical array, tracing the digital signature of the data breach. The encryption override didn't come from an outside hacker. It was broadcasting from a localized transponder right here on the airport grounds, utilizing a master administrative key that only one person possessed. Vivian stared at the flashing terminal code, the last remnants of color draining from her face. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a hollow mix of disbelief and betrayal. "She has my personal biometric override. She's the one who routed our flight plan through the storm. She didn't want us to land safely in New York. She was setting us up for Montgomery Cross." "She's in Executive Hangar 7, Garrett said, his eyes scanning the telemetry map. "She's uploading the baseline propulsion source code to an offshore cloud server, and she's got a light business jet clearing engine start on the auxiliary runway. If that upload reaches 100%, the military architecture I spent a decade hiding will be in the hands of foreign buyers." Vivian looked toward the sofa, where Grace and Bella were holding hands, completely oblivious to the final electronic war playing out across the tarmac. Garrett walked over to the console, pulling a master override breaker that completely blacked out the auxiliary runway's guidance lights, plunging the far side of the airfield into darkness. "Stay here with the girls," Garrett told Vivian, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet command. "I'll handle this." "No," Vivian said, her voice instantly firming with an intense, unyielding resolve. She stepped up beside him, her eyes burning with a fierce maternal fury. "She targeted my daughter, Garrett. She used my trust to put Grace in that sky. I am finishing this with you." Garrett looked at her for a split second, seeing the absolute steel in her posture. He nodded once. He walked to the door of the lounge, signaling 2 remaining elite federal guards to stand watch over Bella and Grace. The matte black tactical truck roared across the darkened tarmac, its headlights completely extinguished as Garrett navigated visually through the fading mist. Hangar 7 loomed ahead, a massive, gleaming silver structure emblazoned with the Apex Aeronautics logo. Inside, a mid-sized corporate jet was idling, its cabin door open, the stairs extended. Standing at the base of the steps was Clara. She was frantically typing into a rugged military-grade laptop resting on a silver briefcase, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the progress bar. The upload hit 98%. Suddenly, the tactical truck shattered the quiet of the hangar, skidding into the space and slamming to a halt directly in front of the jet's nose gear, completely blocking any path of forward movement. The engine died, and Garrett and Vivian stepped out into the bright halogen lights of the hangar. Clara jumped back, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she saw Vivian standing there, alive, breathing, and flanked by the broad, imposing figure of the man she thought she had successfully ruined earlier that afternoon. "Vivian," Clara stammered, trying to slam the laptop shut, but her hands were shaking too violently. I thought you were still in the VIP terminal. The storm, the flight data, was compromised." "Shut it down, Clara," Vivian said, her voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that echoed off the high metal walls of the hangar. Clara's panicked expression slowly morphed into a bitter, twisted sneer. She realized the game was entirely over. She gripped the silver briefcase tightly against her chest. "You think you're a queen, Vivian. You inherited this empire from your father. I did the actual work. I navigated the boards. I signed the defense contracts, while you spent all your time trying to protect your weak, Fragile child. Vanguard offered me 40% shares in the new conglomerate. I was going to be the ruler of the global aerospace market. You were going to kill my daughter, Vivienne whispered, her hands clenching into fists as she took a slow, deliberate step forward. I was going to stabilize the market, Clara hissed, raising her chin in a final, arrogant attempt to hold on to her crumbling power. And you can't stop the transmission. It's at 99%. In 10 seconds, the Black Sky Initiative belongs to the global network, and your precious company will be bankrupt by morning. You have no legal authority to stop me here. Garrett Vance walked forward, his heavy boots echoing like a drumbeat on the pristine concrete. He didn't look at Clara's bitter face. He didn't argue with her logic. He simply reached out his large, weathered hand, gripped the thick fiber-optic data cable connecting her laptop to the hangar's main satellite uplink, and ripped it completely out of the wall with a single, massive pull. The laptop screen instantly flashed a brilliant red error message. Transmission failed. Connection terminated. Garrett looked down at the ruined cable, then met Clara's stunned, breathless gaze with a calm, freezing blue stare. I wrote the protocol for that system, Clara, Garrett said softly, his voice carrying the absolute crushing weight of a military titan. You can't upload a shadow code to a network I built the firewalls for. The transmission didn't fail. It was routed directly to the Federal Defense server. You just signed your own espionage warrant. From the shadows of the hangar entrance, the sharp, authoritative click of standard-issue military rifles echoed through the room. General Pendleton stepped into the light, followed by 6 armed soldiers. Take her, the general ordered simply. Clara screamed in rage as the soldiers grabbed her arms, wrenching the silver briefcase from her grip and slapping heavy steel restraints around her wrists. She looked at Vivienne, her face distorted with pure envy and malice as she was dragged out into the rainy night. How the hell did you find him? She shrieked. He was just a mechanic. He was nobody. He is the man who saved my world, Vivienne said quietly, watching her former assistant disappear into the darkness. 6 months later, the cold, violent winter had completely broken, giving way to a gorgeous, sun-drenched spring afternoon in Boston. The narrow streets of the working-class neighborhood were lined with blooming green trees, the air fresh and warm. The small bungalow on Elmhurst Street had been entirely transformed. The peeling paint was gone, replaced by a beautiful, deep, slate-gray finish. The drafty windows had been replaced with reinforced insulated glass, and the old rusted barn at the edge of the property had been rebuilt into a state-of-the-art private engineering workspace. Garrett Vance stood by the open doors of the new workshop, wearing a clean black t-shirt and jeans. He was wiping grease from his fingers with a rag, a deep, peaceful smile on his face as he watched the backyard. Bella and Grace were sprinting through the green grass, their laughter echoing loudly through the quiet neighborhood. Grace was wearing a small pair of denim overalls, completely unbothered by a smudge of dirt on her cheek, while Bella chased her with a bright plastic bubble wand. The 2 little girls had become completely inseparable, a true, blended family bound by an absolute bond of sisterhood. A sleek, elegant luxury car pulled up to the driveway, not a black sedan with tinted windows, but a beautiful, open-top vintage vehicle that Vivienne drove entirely by herself now. Vivienne stepped out of the car. She wore a simple, elegant sundress, her hair flowing naturally in the warm breeze. The cold, unyielding armor of the billionaire executive had completely dissolved over the past half-year. She had restructured Apex Aeronautics, stepping back from the frantic, cutthroat global corporate race to spend every single weekend here, in this quiet, ordinary neighborhood. She walked up the gravel path, her green eyes locking onto Garrett's calm blue gaze. The emotional current between them had grown deeper, warmer, and entirely undeniable with every passing week. Are the girls behaving? Vivienne asked, stepping into the shade of the workshop, her voice soft and full of genuine happiness. Garrett chuckled, his large hand gently catching her waist as she reached his side. He pulled her slightly closer, his touch entirely natural, steady, and protective. They've been planning a backyard campout for 3 days, Garrett said, his low voice vibrating with a quiet, masculine warmth. Bella told me you're in charge of setting up the tent. Vivienne laughed, a rich, free sound that she had never made in the sterile boardrooms of her past life. She rested her hands against his chest, looking up into his eyes with a profound, emotional reverence. I think I can handle a tent, Colonel. If I get stuck, I know a highly qualified aerospace genius who can fix the structural algorithms for me. Garrett's smile softened, his gaze lingering on her lips before he leaned down. Neural Algord, his forehead gently resting against hers in a quiet, intimate pause. You don't need a genius, Vivian, Garrett murmured softly. You've already built the only thing that actually matters. Vivian closed her eyes, soaking in the absolute, unshakable safety of his embrace. She had spent her entire life believing that her billions could buy security, that her power could manufacture safety, and that her wealth was her greatest legacy. But standing here, in the arms of a humble single father who had walked away from the entire world just to protect his child, she knew the absolute truth. True wealth wasn't measured in corporate shares or international empires. It was measured in the quiet, peaceful laughter of two little girls playing in the grass, and the steady, unyielding love of a family chosen not by blood, but by a profound, unbreakable devotion to each other. They were finally home, completely safe and entirely free.